and welcome back to Sustainability Mindshift, where we are exploring what it takes to be a sustainability leader today, including the skills and capabilities and especially the mindsets that are critical for success. I'm your host, Brad Pierce, and I'm extremely delighted to have with us here today Anna Birney. Hey,
Hi.
Anna. It's great to have you. Let me tell you a little bit about Anna. Anna is currently the director of the School for Systems Change and Global Director of Learning and Community at Forum for the Future. She is a world-leading expert in systems change, systems innovation, leadership development, organizational capacity building, and adult learning. All critical things for today in our world of change. She's passionate about designing and facilitating systems change programs that support people, communities, and organizations to transform their practice. In the past, she has led the Systems Innovation Lab, also at the Forum for the Future, which explores the paradigm shift that's required to shift people's mindsets, behaviors, and social structures. And she's also run the Leadership and Change program that works to ensure that individuals and organizations show leadership in sustainable development. She's worked as a trainer and educator for the World Wildlife Fund and also does a lot of work as coach and facilitator for a number of forward-thinking programs, and she's based in the UK. We're super happy to have you here. Yeah.
Great. It's great to be here too. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Really happy. It's perfect timing right now. As we're in the lead up to the COP26, that would be, for those of you that don't know, it's the United Nations Conference of Parties, COP26, which is happening in Glasgow at the end of this month, starting October 30th or 31st, I believe. So in the spirit of COP26, I'd like to address this key question, which has been reported a lot in the past in these UN reports, about how do we get the level of ambition and action beyond what Greta Thunberg has said a number of times, the blah, blah, blah. How do we get that level of ambition and action up to the level that's needed to transform the world? And that includes setting ourselves free of the old paradigms and sensing into the new emerging systems about what this new future can look like. That's some of the regenerative principles and language I've been learning over the last few months here in Sustainability Mindshift that I'm very excited. It's a whole new world is opening up. So I wanted to hear from your perspective, Anna, and the work that you're doing and the work of other systems change agents. It's super critical right now because I think, as I said, we're at that inflection point where the old way of doing things just isn't working. It's clear that's not working. And we see change happening all around us right now. The Earth is clearly speaking very loudly, loud and clear through climate change. So how do we get the leaders that are meeting, including the political and social and societal and business leaders, as well as all the other experts, scientists, academics, philosophers, engineers, how do we get everybody to look at our human systems and align those human systems around these emerging natural systems? Where do we even start?
Well, I guess I'll sort of start with where I started as well. So there's something about a deep philosophy of learning that I have, that a lot of the challenges that we're facing are unknowable in some ways. We can't really know how the future will emerge. We can't really know what's going to happen. We didn't really predict COVID. Maybe some people said we will have a pandemic at some point, but we couldn't really predict it. And so my journey kind of started when I was a child and I was diagnosed with dyslexia. And that was one of the biggest gifts that could ever be given to me, because what it did was it enabled me to have a wonderful teacher who really helped me to learn, helped me be a learner, and helped me be a questioner as well. Helped me question the way I learned, the way I thought, and not sideline it, but say, this is okay. The who you are is what you are. And so through that kind of starting place, I started to understand the world as patterns, and a lot of our education system doesn't really help us see in the kind of the way the world works, to see in kind of the systemic way. And I think my brain naturally was kind of asking these big questions about the world, was seeing things quite mathematically, or I did quite a lot of science as well in terms of these patterns. And I was lucky enough to have this teacher who was basically supporting me to go with that type of thinking, go with the way that my brain was working, go with what felt natural to me rather than something that was trying to push me into an education system.
Like a box, right?
The box, exactly. And I think this is where we're now saying there's something to start with, which we're sort of saying, oh, we need to learn this new skill of systems change. So yes, that pretty much is what I'm now doing in my career, is supporting people to build capacity for systems change. However, what we've got to remember is that we have an innate system sensibility within us. We are naturally systems thinkers. We naturally can understand the natural world. We love going, we saw in the pandemic, people love going outside, connecting back into nature, not being stuck behind our Zoom screens the whole time. It is in us already. What we've done, though, is we've created educational systems, managerial systems. We've created ways of working in the world that have been very efficient and productive in helping us make progress. But it has also created externalities, it's created social inequalities, and it's also created the climate emergency amongst other biosphere breakdowns. And so now the question is how might we work more in line, as you said, Brad, with the way the natural systems work? How do we retake on that systemic sensibility and make it into the day-to-day practice that we need as change makers and leaders?
So interesting. Oh man, I had a teacher too in sixth grade that was so profoundly, it had such a profound impact on my life because he did what your teacher did. He saw me for who I was, and the kind of learning that I needed. I'd actually been living in England for 3 years, from the age of 7 to 10, and then we moved to Spain. And so my early years of education had been in the British system. So that's the way I was taught to think. And then moving into the American system at the American School of Madrid, which was, it's just like free reign. I could sit in the back of the class and toss, paper balls at my friend and really sort of lost track or it was a different way of learning, I guess. And he brought me back because he knew he was from England himself and he knew the way that, the education system was in England versus US based. But getting back to the subject, it's interesting because the teachers that can sort of see you for who you are and help guide you, I think that's an important role for systems change agents today too, to help, help leaders, help them understand where they are, help them step out of this world of, where do we lose that inquiry and that, the ability to sort of stop and look at the systems around us instead of taking it seems like we build systems that take thinking out of it, that takes the inquiry out of it, takes that connecting the dots out of our daily life. How do we help leaders start to shift the way of thinking?
Well, so a lot of our programs and the work that we do, so very much coaching from when people are, so really starting from where they are is a critical part there. And we're sort of saying, well, where are you? How do you use the resources and assets of where you are to create change? So that's the first question. How do you do it in practice? So we don't teach people the thinking skills without the applicability of it, right? So we really make sure that they're doing that on the work that's in front of them. But I think the key thing is, we do teach frameworks and tools and approaches like systems diagnostic tools, thinking about how do they think about the future, how do they think about mapping the system, mapping the problems. But we actually introduce them to a lot of different frameworks and tools. And the key of that is it's like building a muscle. For me, it's like you could be going to the gym, for example, and if you just do one sport, like you just pump one arm, it's not really going to make you into a fitter person. You've got to do a bit of swimming, a bit of running, a bit of weightlifting, a bit of whatever takes your fancy to kind of create a whole healthy body. And so I think that's the same with how we think as well. We need to kind of get that malleability and flexibility to kind of have different routes into kind of thinking systemically. And that's not just thinking as well. So there's something about thinking and being, like how do we start practicing this? How do we start making this a part of our ways of looking at a problem? So you don't have to necessarily recruit a massive consultancy to do a 4-month diagnosis, although we do stuff like that. I think there's also something about how do you just sit in a meeting and go, what is the systemic lens, the regenerative lens that we need to bring to this? And how do you bring that to the everyday as well?
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that, because that's one of the things I've been grappling with. And I know it's changing right now, which I'm really happy to see. But I think, the last say 10 or 15 years of management consulting and specifically sustainability consultants, and I'm one of them. We're good at sort of connecting those dots as you have done in the past, because we've, for whatever reason, our life experience, how we grew up, our worldview shaped us into the person we are, and all the learning that we've done over the, in my case, the past couple of decades. And I often forget that I am looking through a very different lens than some of the leaders are looking through. And I think some of the, the management consultants and sustainability consultants that provide these roadmaps, and they say, here you go, it's a clear, here's a clear map for you to get from point A to point Z. But the fact that there has to be other work that's paired with that allows them to understand it in a whole new level in the context of their job and their role and their teams.
Yeah, completely. They need to. So this is why we need to build capacity alongside doing strategy work, for example. So we need to do the strategy work with them, but we also need them to kind of see how, we've done strategy processes, and you can leave them with their strategy. And then they're going, oh, but we don't understand how we continually work with this. Because strategy, actually a systemic strategy, or strategy that seeks to understand where to intervene in these big systems, the systems are constantly changing. The problems are constantly changing. They're moving feasts. So this idea within 5-year strategies now is sort of going out the window, because what we've got to create is the process of continually strategizing or continually learning. And so through that, you can be adapting to what's happening around you. And everyone's kind of like, what's the emergency response to COVID? How do we deal with it? And there's something about, well, how do we have in place the mechanisms that can deal with these shocks, these changes, these shifts that's going on? And so I think building the ability to continually be strategic is more important than building a strategy. For example, strategies are great, but actually it's the tapping into what's behind this. How do we know how to continually pivot, how to adapt, how to move, becomes a more important skill, I would say, than this kind of what do we need to work on. It's almost like how do we need to work becomes a bigger question.
Yeah, interesting. And so you're talking about something too where, I think you're dealing with emergencies, which businesses are dealing with, so many of them today, especially with COVID, throwing a wrench in their operations and the way employees work and all of the changes that are going on. So how do you, how do they address those on the fly? And as we were talking about earlier, sense into the emerging systems, because as we all know, or at least we being, what I'm learning in the space from experts like you, is that we are going through this moment of change. Systems are changing. Old systems aren't working anymore. So we are going to need to transform. And that word transformation is thrown around a lot. I know when people hear it and they're like, okay, yeah, whatever. It's sort of like the next, Six Sigma, the next, quality control movement, or sustainability is sort of a movement, a thing, good for our brand, But this is systems change. It boggles my mind the scale of change that's needed from the systems that are so entrenched. Even just looking at a supply chain, logistics, and how something I order on Amazon gets to my front door in 2 days still blows my mind. So, as those systems are changing, how do you deal with current emergencies and transform at the same time to a new, entirely different system?
Yeah, and what's happening there, and our future sustainability reports talked about these different mindsets that are kind of playing out. So it's like, what is the mindset that needs to play out as you are working through both, and the unsettling, the kind of disruption. But disruption can be, it's not great and we don't invite it in, but as it's happening, it is disrupting the patterns. The systems are just patterns of behavior that are structured over time, and they get stuck in those structures. And what we're trying to do is repattern them, restructure them to operate in a different way, to different goals, and based on different paradigmal kind of mental models. And so the process of transformation is really kind of taking those different mindsets, those different mental models, and recreating or creating new models, new approaches that we can put into those structures that might start repatterning how that system operates. So that is transformation, really. It's not trying to say, I think we overwhelmed. I was speaking at something yesterday and they were kind of going, I'm feeling overwhelmed by the scale of change. Like, we're talking about the whole economic system here. We're talking about the whole societal system. It's huge. Like, it really is massive, and it can be overwhelming. But at the same time, if we all start playing and working and experimenting with probing this system from where we are, it's like, what new models of operating, what new model of governance, what new models of economics, or what, how do we deliver different parts of the supply chain? What would it mean to totally put justice and regeneration at the heart of something like that? We're trying to look at a piece of work at the moment called the future of value chains. Like, how do we shift the nature of value exchange in that and model it? And that becomes a fractal, a pattern of saying this is how it could work, but we could start to experiment and say, how does that fit within our current system? And how does it start to change the nature of the way that that whole system is patterned and works? So that for me is kind of some insights into the that's quite technical, the way of what I've just been talking about, but you can hopefully start to see the language and how you start to think about this process of transformation. So it's not this kind of linear, we were all jogging along and then suddenly we change. There's this process of rerouting the relationships, rerouting the way things are organized in the systems that we see around us at the moment.
So rerouting the relationships and the patterns and the systems. I know that a lot of the work that you've been doing has been around power structures, and so I want to switch gears a bit, and I'd love to hear more about the work you're doing in power structures, and as a follow up to that too. So there's power structures that entail probably individuals, but also more collective organization of people. But also then there's the sense of, again, getting back to the individual and how do they change within themselves to affect the overall power structure.
Yeah, and I think that's a good call, because when we talk about relationships, we are really talking about the exchange of energies, and the exchange of energies is power. And so we get stuck in models of power that are power over, but actually the best way to understand it, and I think you're totally right, is not just at this massive societal level. It's actually at the what are the relationships we have around us as an individual, and the teams that we work with, the organizations we work in, or the organizing forms. So that's more of the thing we've been talking about, is what are the different forms of organizing? So collaboratives, networks, ecosystems, how different people kind of organize to come together for change. And the power in that is sort of really understanding how do you change the flows of information, the flows of finance and resources between people. So you start to have interesting conversations about decision making, about governance, about remuneration, how and who gets paid for what. And in those conversations, you're actually trying to demonstrate and model different leadership for change, really, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, when you were talking about flows, I was thinking the first thing that came to mind was, okay, well, that's a process thing, right? There's flows of information, like how does information move through the organization? How is what you're putting in your computer getting into the right hands so that they can have the data they need to make a decision? But actually, then as you were talking, it occurred to me that, a big part of that flow is person to person flow. How is one person talking to the other? And that gets back to the heart of it makes every difference how, every decision, every way that you communicate as a leader matters. How the people that you're bringing into a discussion, the kind of dialogue you're having, the kind of inquiry that you're having, how you're listening, getting back to how you grew up, matters. And I think a lot of people today feel like, oh, well, they're in their little box in their little world, and they think, oh, I can just kind of get away with being the jerk or the micromanager, and not, or holding on to this information because I need to look good or whatever it is that their habits are of performance, and they don't think it's going to necessarily make a difference because they're just one person. Whereas you're saying it absolutely makes a difference because, yeah.
The way that power also works is like, I guess that there's a complexity theorist we work with called Jean Bolton, and she speaks on our programs. And she taught one of the things she really said was what you put into the system becomes the system. And so, like, if you think of the system as constantly reconstructing itself, the kinds of things you put into the system will become that system. It's in our behaviors. And so as a leader, and especially therefore you have got an accumulation of power just by the default of your positionality, your rank, the power that you have. And leaders don't have to be positional. They can also be because you've got sort of spiritual power or social power in a place. And the how you act in that, how you communicate, exactly how you come forward with people, and just the way you relate to people just starts demonstrating new models, starts showing people what it means to be different as a leader. So, how do you, a skill that I learned quite a lot through my facilitation training, which I think facilitative leadership is very much something that I'm kind of owning and following a bit more, is this idea of leaning in, leaning out. I used to be a leader who kind of used to lean out a bit more, of kind of like, I'm facilitating and I'm up, whatever ideas you have is great, so you're kind of saying, here, have them. But what I was forgetting to do is I actually had a rank and role in the room. I was the team leader in this instance. And so they were kind of waiting for me to say something. So I was sort of letting everyone's ideas come. And then when I would say something, they'd kind of go, yes, that's the idea. And you're like, no, I really want us to collectively decide this.
Yeah.
So what I was forgetting to do was to lean forward at the beginning. So now there's something that I've learned through kind of deep democracy processes, which is you lean in at the beginning as a leader and you say, this is what I think, this is where I'm coming from. But you, in the same instance, you lean back and you say, what do you think? And I really want to hear you, and I really want to know where you are. And you really demonstrate that over time, especially you work with groups over time, that you genuinely do want to hear, that you really will take on their views, and you do change your decision making and you change what you're about from what you've heard. And that shifts the culture. That starts shifting the pattern of how we relate. And you're not ignoring your power. What you're doing is you're saying, yeah, I have power here, and I'm modeling that. But I'm also demonstrating that I really can move, and I'm flexible, and I'm open, and I believe in the wisdom of the group as well. And I think that was a really massive shift for my leadership, actually, from that way of working to kind of owning my own leadership, because it started to know how to work with the real dynamics in the room and then to shift them.
That's so funny. It's interesting that you say that. When I used to facilitate programs for this leadership development consulting company, when I was facilitating business simulations, I was told something I'd never heard before, but I guess it's sort of a common phrase. But this wonderful woman who is a co-founder of the organization, the company, said, Brad, you need to be less of a sage on the stage, and you need to be a guide on the side more. And that stuck with me, a sage on the stage versus guide on the side. But what you're saying, which is really interesting, is it's not necessarily that. It's a little of both. You need to be the guide on the side, or whatever, or sage on the stage first, and then move to be more the guide on the side.
Exactly. And I'm also saying that there's role fluidity in that. So you're really knowing what role you're taking and you're naming that. So sometimes I'll go into a room and say, I recognize that I'm, only a facilitator, or I recognize that I'm the leader in this room, or I recognize, so you're naming where you are. And that also sets people at ease by going, you know what, and you're willing to move, you're willing to shift that and say, okay, but now I'm this. Or, I sometimes facilitate things where I also have a stake in the decision making. And I kind of then will say, actually, I'm just going to give my opinion here. And now I'm going to come back to be the facilitator. And that really helps people, like, show that, one, you're flexible and you move and you're moving your mind around all the time, but you're being clear and bringing awareness. So a lot of these processes and the ways of is bringing awareness to what's happening. And that can happen at this small group level, but it also can happen in big organizations, and it can happen in bigger systems. Bringing awareness to what's happening and being really clear about that is an important, as leaders, you're often a spokesperson for a bigger system. Is also a really important thing to be doing.
And it's interesting too when you have so the idea of opening up to dialogue and being the wisdom, as you say, exists out there, right? Nobody's really the expert. What do we really all know? It exists out there among us, and to be open to something new and creative that comes out in the dialogue, in diversity of perspective and thought. Although I know some leaders would say, if I do that, it's just going to open up room for, we're going to just, sidelined and, go way down some rabbit hole. And so tell me more about, like, we were talking earlier about how maybe purpose, a sense of purpose and the company's North Star as the sort of overused phrase. But as you have this guiding light that continues to keep your thoughts oriented, and the leader's job to sort of keep that conversation oriented in the direction so that they don't go off too much. Well,
it's not that they go off. You've got to listen to why people are going off. If they're going off, there's something really interesting happening on the edge, right? So there's something really interesting there. So the key thing as your facilitation or as your leader is to spot that and understand what wisdom that's sharing to the process. Is it there's resistance in the room, that people are resistant to what's happening, that something hasn't been said? Or is it that there's an underlying problem that needs to be addressed? So there's something about really actually valuing the fact that it's not going off track, that there's some real wisdom in that. But you also have got to be clear about what the boundaries of the discussion are, or what you're trying to achieve here, and be open to move that and reset the boundaries if need be. And so I think we've got to not be scared of that. But I think the skill sometimes is to reframe, to still keep a process moving and on in the direction of whatever you set yourself, like a deeper purpose of sometimes it's this kind of big, just and regenerative world. Or maybe it's a sub-purpose, like we need to get a strategy out of this, but this is what we need to be looking at. But you're kind of constantly reframing what that goal is, or saying, well, actually, now we've learned from you, we will set this new boundary. Are we all in agreement with that? Because so I think we're scared of things going off track. And actually, if we don't listen to the off track, then we're not really believing in the wisdom of people. So it's knowing how to work with that rather than having to keep people on the tram lines.
That's so interesting. So tell me more though about, I love this topic of purpose. So where does purpose fit in the world of systems change? And how do you help companies, that either, maybe they even have a stated purpose, but what does it take from an individual level, a leadership level to, embed that sense of purpose in everything they do and align their organization around that, especially when the purpose is helping the organization transform. I know the purpose. I understand purpose your purpose shouldn't change. That should be the one thing that's sort of the guiding light. But the organizational structures and patterns and processes to move the organization and ultimately the world and the systems that the business relies on in the right direction.
Yeah, well, I would challenge that a purpose should never change. I think a purpose could change, but it's what it's an expression of. And I go back to your original question, which is something about the alignment of human systems to natural systems, so the social systems to natural systems. And I think when we're doing work on systems purpose, we start to ask the question of, what is the purpose that your organization, your initiative, or your team is contributing to? And what is that? How is that part of these bigger systems? And what function in that system is it really playing? So for example, we ran this project on protein. And originally we were talking about meat. This is all about meat production. This is all about meat production. And because that's the problem with carbon and how much carbon we're emitting. And actually, the bigger purpose of meat is protein, right? So the purpose isn't meat production. The purpose is to provide protein needs. And then you can ask the question of, okay, how do you change the protein needs? Like, how do you meet the protein needs? So what's the bigger whole? What's the bigger purpose that you are contributing to? And really saying, does that align to this bigger social environmental goals that we're seeking? And I think we don't always understand not just, we have a lovely fluffy purpose. It's like, how do we test our purpose against these bigger societal environmental purposes or ecological? How do we align to a regenerative worldview? So regenerative worldview is really about aligning our purposes to the whole, to the bigger whole. And so when we actually look at real purposes of businesses, I'm sorry to say that a lot of their real purpose is to help shareholders, right? Shareholder growth. That's what a lot of its behaviors are demonstrating. And so therefore we say, well, if you really want a real purpose, that means you'll do anything that is aligning. Maybe your purpose is to change the distribution of wealth or resources in the world, or help, whatever I can't think of a business. It's quite interesting. We did some work way back with Royal Mail, and we were talking about what is your purpose? And they were saying it was getting letters to people. But then we looked at what their structure and function was, and actually said that their biggest asset was their network of what are they called, post people. And so actually it was about their distribution network that their biggest structure was, or asset. And actually their purpose was about distribution and connecting. And we say, what how do you use that to change your business model? But the problem is they'd kept their strong purpose, which is, oh, we're about mail. And therefore, were they being adaptable enough to say our shifting purpose might be a bigger whole, a bigger thing we contribute to, which is much more about being in every town and every street in the UK anyway. And so there was an interesting conversation about shifting purposes, like, because it's about trying to align those purposes with what society and the environment needs, not just wedding whole to something just because it's always been there.
Wow, and that resonates too with what's going on with what's behind me, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and what's going on with the UN. I think companies are increasingly participating and at least identifying how and where they can contribute based on hopefully a sort of a realigned purpose around this bigger whole. And I think the challenge is that I think using old ways of thinking, I've seen some companies where they've picked however many number of SDGs that are aligned with their operational strategies. And they're like, okay, this is where we're going to double down, but not necessarily thinking about the systemic relationship between all of these SDGs, and such that you could have a very big, powerful company say, oh well, the only the thing that we address or touch most is zero hunger if it's a food company, so we're going to double down on this. It's like the Green Revolution, right? We're going to just put cornfields everywhere, and it's going to feed the hunger, and then we'll be done with that. It's like, okay, we've solved the hunger crisis, but then they don't think about, well, but then you're also consuming other resources that, are needed for growing corn. And how does that impact, other things like the climate or water scarcity? And so it is really a systemic problem. And it's interesting that the SDGs can be a way for companies to start to think more systemically, not just have their traditional sort of sustainability goals where they kind of, set these goals based on what their priorities are or what they might have heard from stakeholders, but might be disconnected from the bigger picture and how they can collaborate with other organizations to make it happen.
Exactly. And a lot of them use the SDGs as like pillars. So like, these are our 3 pillars, and pillars are just separate things that are not connected. This is not connecting to deeper or wider purposes. It's just saying, here are the 3 things we need to get better at and do better at in our strategy. That's not shifting the nature of the business and shifting what it is. I remember doing some work for a sports manufacturer on sports design, and selling their trainers and saying, well, they need to sell more trainers. We need to just innovate the product and say, well, how do we make sure that it's more recycled and it has less water in the manufacturing process? However, there's a challenge there of like, are you manufacturing goods, or actually are you a brand that can support health? Because you're helping people run, you're helping people do sport. And that's when you can get the watches or the other goods that are not just increasing consumption, they're actually providing a design service. And so we've seen this shift from product to service, but I think it's a bigger thing about what's your purpose, So the real question under that is your purpose about providing goods or fast moving consumer goods, that's a big problem? Or is it about enabling people to do something? Is it about being healthy citizens? Is it about what they can do, being active? And that shifts that could shift the business, right? That could be that shift in purpose, not just saying, well, who are we, but what's our role in society, could actually shift the whole nature of what you start designing and doing as an organization and business.
And I'm sure executives would love to hear that, because what you just said there too is that that work and purpose can also lead to opportunities to innovate and new market opportunities and new revenue streams. If you identify that for example, we're health and now we can start selling. And
also we've got to have revenue streams that are putting the planet first. We will not have businesses. We will not have organizations in the future that doesn't do that. Like it's gone is the time where we can just have growth and we can also deal with the environmental problems, or we can deal with inequities, but as long as we still have growth. It's like, no, actually these problems come first now. We can't have a society without dealing with justice and without dealing with the deep environmental challenges. And then we can say, well, what kind of business can serve that? That's the flip that needs to happen now. Gone is the time of just saying, hey, all growth is good as long as we're doing the social and environmental side of things as well.
Yeah, well, business is one of the greatest human inventions to solve societal and planetary problems. And I do hope that COP26 turns out as successful as we all need it to be, and and the world starts to listen more to experts like you in change and systems thinking, so that we can help solve all this together. I really appreciate your time today, Anna. You've been great. It's good to see you again.
Lovely. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a fun chat.
Cool. Thanks.